There is a certain stillness that settles when a story begins to show what it has kept hidden beneath its most familiar moments for years. Dragon Ball Z has lived inside the memories of hundreds of millions of people across more than 3 decades. And yet, beneath the battles and the blinding light, there are quiet details that most viewers have never fully encountered. Tonight, we move slowly through those details, through the forgotten choices and the small truths that shaped one of the greatest stories ever told. So let the room grow soft and settle in. Subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories if tonight brings you peace. And as you begin to rest, know that the story of Dragon Ball Z held its first great secret in something as simple as a name. The Saiyan race in Dragon Ball Z carries one of the most quietly elegant naming traditions in all of animation. Every Saiyan character in the series, without a single exception, has a name rooted in some variation of the word for vegetable. It is a detail that runs through the entire bloodline, from the proudest warrior to the smallest child, and most people who watched the show for years never noticed it at all. Goku's Saiyan birth name, Kakarot, is a soft rearrangement of the word carrot. His father, Bardock, whose name is a variation of burdock root, carried the tradition long before the series ever showed his face on screen. Vegeta, the prince of all Saiyans, shares his name almost directly with the word vegetable itself, as though Toriyama wanted the royalty of the race to wear the pun most openly of all. Raditz, Goku's older brother and the first true antagonist of Dragon Ball Z, takes his name from radish. Nappa, the towering Saiyan general who fought alongside Vegeta in the first major arc of the series, carries a name derived from a type of cabbage leaf. Even Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan from the films, has a name that echoes broccoli, placed there with the same quiet intention that defined every other name in the lineage. What makes this tradition so unusual is how invisible it managed to remain. The names do not announce themselves. They do not call attention to the joke or ask the audience to notice. They simply exist, folded into the fabric of the story, the way a watermark exists in fine paper, present for those who look, invisible to those who don't. Toriyama applied this same system of naming puns across nearly every character group in the series, extending it far beyond the Saiyans into nearly every corner of the world he created. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The vegetable tradition was only one thread in a much larger tapestry of wordplay that Toriyama wove into Dragon Ball Z from its very first character to its last. The Frieza Force carries cold temperature names running through nearly every member of the family and their associates. Frieza himself is a soft variation of the word freezer. His brother Cooler, who appears in 2 non-canon films, makes the theme even more direct, and their father, King Cold, completes the pattern so plainly it almost feels like it was never intended to be a secret. The Ginyu Force carries its own distinct naming thread, one that is easy to miss on first viewing. The word Ginyu itself is derived from a Japanese word relating to milk. Each member of the squad, Jis, Birder, Rikum, Guldo, and Captain Ginyu, carries a name that maps onto a dairy product when rendered in the original Japanese. Rikum connects to cream, Birder to butter, Guldo to yogurt, and Jis to cheese. Toriyama assembled an elite team of some of the most feared warriors in Frieza's empire and named them after things you might find in a refrigerator. The Namekians follow a different kind of logic, with names drawn from words and sounds associated with snails and slugs. Piccolo's name maps onto a small musical instrument in Italian, but within the naming conventions of Namekians more broadly, there is a quiet softness to the sounds, nail, dende, guru, cargo, that gives the race a distinct vocal texture even before you understand anything about where their names come from. It is a consistency that rewards the kind of attention most viewers never had a reason to apply. Bulma's family follows a pattern rooted in undergarments. Bulma's name derives from bloomers, a type of old-fashioned underclothing. Her mother Panchi takes her name from panties. Her father, Dr. Brief, draws from the same cloth, so to speak. Even Trunks, Bulma's son from the future, continues the pattern across a generation, which means Toriyama was thinking about naming conventions not just character by character, but family, building a world whose humor ran all the way down into the foundations. The World Martial Arts Tournament fighters carry names connected to dumplings and other Chinese foods. Krillin's name in Japanese connects to chestnut. Yamcha's name draws from yumcha, a style of Chinese dining. Even Master Roshi's various aliases tie into foods and herbs in ways that reward patience. None of this is ever explained in the series itself. It exists quietly underneath the surface of every episode, present for anyone who chooses to look and invisible to everyone who doesn't. Raditz is one of the strangest figures in Dragon Ball Z, not because of who he is, but because of what he represents. He appears in only a handful of episodes. He is defeated relatively quickly, and yet without him, the entire structure of the series collapses. He is the door through which everything enters. Without Raditz arriving on Earth at the beginning of the story, there is no revelation that Goku is a Saiyan, no threat from space, no Vegeta, no Namek, no Frieza. The entire architecture of Dragon Ball Z begins with a single character who is gone almost before the audience has had the chance to fully meet him. Toriyama has spoken in various interviews about the direction he originally imagined for the story at its very start. When Dragon Ball Z was beginning to take shape as the continuation of the original Dragon Ball series, there was genuine uncertainty about how the alien angle would land with audiences. The revelation that Goku was not from Earth was a significant tonal shift from the Earthbound adventures of the original series, and Toriyama was careful about introducing it. Raditz became the vehicle for that shift, arriving as both a messenger and a test of how far the story could now reach. What is quiet and worth sitting with is that Raditz never truly gets the chance to develop as a character. He is introduced, he explains the Saiyan backstory, he serves his narrative function, and then he is gone. In interviews, there have been hints that Raditz's defeat was always planned to be relatively swift, but that doesn't make his exit feel any less like a door closing just as it opened. He carries more backstory than he ever gets to share, a warrior from a destroyed world, the older brother of a man who had been raised without any memory of him, arriving with a mission that ended in failure within his very first appearance. In later supplementary materials, including video games and the Dragon Ball Minus manga chapter, Raditz received a small amount of additional context. These materials explored the final days of Planet Vegeta and showed a young Raditz standing alongside Vegeta when the planet was destroyed by Frieza. He survived because he was on a mission elsewhere when it happened. He spent years afterwards searching for his lost brother, following the trail of a man who had been sent to a distant world as an infant and had apparently gone silent. By the time Raditz reached Earth, he had traveled farther than most people ever consider, carrying a family connection that Goku could not remember and would never fully embrace. Even in the small moments of his brief appearance, Raditz demonstrates a kind of complexity that the runtime never allowed to fully surface. His power level at the time of his arrival made him nearly untouchable by the standards of Earth's warriors. He was shocked and genuinely confused by the version of his brother he found. A man living quietly with a family, with no interest in conquest, no connection to the Saiyan identity he was supposed to carry. That collision of expectation and reality is one of the most quietly interesting things Dragon Ball Z ever put on screen, and it passed almost before anyone had time to sit with it. There is something unusual and rarely discussed about Piccolo's place in Dragon Ball Z, and it begins long before the Z in the title ever existed. Piccolo, the green, stoic, white-caped warrior who would eventually become one of the most beloved figures in the entire series, is not in any traditional sense a new character. He is, quite specifically, the reincarnation of King Piccolo, the great demon king who served as the final villain of the original Dragon Ball series. When King Piccolo was defeated by Goku, he expelled one final egg containing his reincarnation, a child who would carry his memories, his power, and his mission to destroy the hero who had killed him. This means that the Piccolo who befriends Gohan, who trains him in the wilderness, who sacrifices himself on Namek to protect the child he had come to genuinely love, this Piccolo began his life as an instrument of revenge. He was born specifically to kill Goku. The warmth he eventually develops is not something he arrived with. It was earned slowly, quietly, through experiences that gradually shifted something deep in the nature he had inherited. The duality runs deeper still when you consider Piccolo's relationship with Kami, the guardian of the earth. Kami and Piccolo were once a single being, a Namekian who had come to Earth long ago and, in seeking to become the planet's guardian, separated the evil within himself into a distinct entity. That evil became King Piccolo, which means that Piccolo, on some level, is the evil half of Kami, made flesh, given form, sent into the world as the dark counterpart of the planet's protector. And then Kami and Piccolo eventually merge back into one being during the Cell Saga, restoring what was separated and creating a Piccolo of restored wholeness. It is one of the quietly remarkable character arcs in the series, the journey of a being from fragmented evil to integrated selfhood, told almost entirely through action and circumstance rather than dialogue or explanation. Toriyama rarely drew direct attention to this backstory during the Z era. Piccolo simply became who he became, and the mythology that explained why that was possible existed beneath the surface, available for anyone who wanted to find it. The Saiyan tale is one of the most quietly significant biological details in Dragon Ball Z, and its history across the series reveals a level of thought that the episodes themselves rarely make explicit. Every pure-blooded Saiyan is born with a tail, a brown simian appendage that serves as the most visible marker of their non-human origin. More than that, it is the mechanism through which the Uzaru transformation works, the ability to transform into a massive great ape upon exposure to the full light of a natural moon or an artificial one created through a technique called a power ball. Goku was born with a tail. He lost it multiple times throughout the original Dragon Ball series and into the early episodes of Z. Each time it was removed, it eventually grew back, except, eventually, it stopped. At a certain point, Goku's tail was permanently removed, and it never returned. The reason for this, at least in the narrative logic of the world, seems connected to his growth beyond the transformation, a body that had outpaced the biological need for it. In the Deyasu guidebooks, there is some elaboration on this point, suggesting that a Saiyan of sufficient power can eventually lose the biological dependence on the tail entirely. Gohan, Goku's son, was also born with a tail. As a half-Saiyan carrying the trait, his tail was removed by Piccolo early in the story and did not regrow in the way a full-blooded Saiyan's might. Vegeta never lost his tail during the series proper, though it was eventually removed off-screen before the later sagas, something that the show never quite addressed directly, leaving it as one of those quiet continuity points that exists between the scenes, rather than inside them. The Uzaru form itself carries an interesting set of rules. The transformation requires the full moon, whether natural or artificial. It multiplies the Saiyan's power level by a factor of 10. And critically, in early Dragon Ball Z, it was established that a Saiyan cannot control themselves in Uzaru form unless they have undergone specific training to do so, which is why Vegeta's Uzaru transformation during the Saiyan Saga was so dangerous. He had the control. He had always had it. It was one of the small details that distinguished the Saiyan elite from the rank and file of the warrior class. The tail's absence in later arcs of the series is rarely commented upon. Even though it represents a meaningful biological shift, the story moves past it the way a river moves past a stone, without stopping, without explanation, simply incorporating the change into the flow of what comes next. It is one of many small moments in Dragon Ball Z where the details accumulate quietly in the background, visible only if you have been paying very close attention to everything that came before. After Goku's death in the battle against Raditz, he was sent along a path in the afterlife called Snake Way, a narrow winding road that stretched across the clouds of Otherworld for an almost unimaginable distance. The canonical length of Snake Way as established in various Dragon Ball reference materials is approximately 1 million kilometers. It is not a metaphor. It is simply the road that the dead must travel to reach King Kai's planet at the far end, and Goku had to run it on foot. The journey took Goku approximately 177 days in total, accounting for a detour through Princess Snake's palace that cost him considerable time and effort. He ran the entirety of it. He did not fly. Flight does not function on Snake Way, in the standard way. And even if it had been possible, the sheer scale of the road meant that the journey was going to consume months of the afterlife regardless of what approach he took. It is one of those quietly staggering details that the show presents matter-of-factly and then moves past almost immediately. King Kai himself is a figure whose surface conceals a great deal of quiet depth. He is introduced as a small, slightly round figure wearing dark glasses, living on a tiny planet at the end of an impossible road, keeping company with a grasshopper named Gregory and a large genial ape named Bubbles. He does not, at first glance, appear to be one of the most significant figures in the cosmology of Dragon Ball Z. And yet he is a supreme-level deity governing an entire quadrant of the universe, responsible for monitoring the galaxy under his jurisdiction, with knowledge and insight that surpassed nearly every figure Goku had encountered up to that point in the story. King Kai's planet carries a gravitational pull 10 times that of Earth's. This is established as part of why training there is so effective. Movement that feels difficult on an ordinary world becomes fluid and almost effortless when you return to standard gravity. Goku spent approximately 3 months training on King Kai's planet before the Saiyan warriors arrived on Earth. In that time, he learned the Kaioken technique, a method of multiplying his power and speed by concentrating his life energy, and he learned the Spirit Bomb, a technique for gathering the ambient energy of every living thing willing to contribute it. Both of these techniques became defining elements of Goku's fighting style through the Saiyan and Namek sagas. The Kaioken in particular was used repeatedly and often pushed far beyond the limits King Kai had recommended. During the battle with Frieza on Namek, Goku pushed the Kaioken to 20 times its standard multiplier, a level that King Kai had explicitly warned was likely to tear the body apart. That Goku survived it at all was presented as something close to miraculous, a function of his Saiyan constitution that allowed him to endure stresses no ordinary body could have managed. Throughout Dragon Ball Z, several of the main characters are shown wearing what appear to be ordinary clothes: a gi, a training uniform, a set of boots. The audience is told early in the series that these garments are not ordinary at all. The weighted training gear worn by Goku and later by other characters during intensive training periods adds significant additional weight to every movement, creating constant physical resistance that gradually forces the body to adapt beyond what it could achieve under comfortable conditions. In the early episodes of the series, it is revealed that Goku's training clothes weigh approximately 80 kilograms, about 176 pounds, distributed across his body as he trains and travels. When he removes them during combat, the sudden reduction in resistance translates into a noticeable increase in speed and power relative to what he had been demonstrating while wearing them. It is a technique borrowed loosely from real-world athletic training philosophy and applied to the extraordinary physical context of the Dragon Ball universe. The detail matters in a subtle way because it frames the everyday movements of these characters differently. Goku is not simply walking across a field in a comfortable gi. He is walking across a field carrying the equivalent of an adult human being in added weight, building strength with every step, every movement, every casual interaction. The training is happening continuously, even in the quiet moments between the battles. Even at rest, these characters are working. Piccolo is shown training in a similar fashion, meditating at great height while wearing weights so heavy that the show makes a point of demonstrating the sound they make when he removes them. The crash of discarded training weights became one of the quiet sounds of Dragon Ball Z's training sequences, a signal that something significant was about to happen, that the character had decided to stop measuring themselves against the resistance they'd been carrying and fight at their actual capacity instead. Vegeta's character in Dragon Ball Z is defined in many ways by his relationship to training, specifically his willingness to push that training to extremes that the show presents as genuinely dangerous. The gravity chamber developed by Dr. Briefat Capsule Corporation became the primary symbol of this obsession, a room that could simulate gravitational forces far beyond what any natural environment on Earth could provide. Vegeta trains in the gravity chamber at 300 times Earth's standard gravity during his preparation for the android's arc, a level of force that causes the room to catastrophically explode during a session, resulting in a dramatic image of Vegeta standing in the flaming wreckage, continuing his training in the open air, as though the destruction of the facility were a minor inconvenience. He does not stop. He does not pause. He simply continues, because in Vegeta's understanding of the world, stopping is not something warriors do when inconvenienced by the conditions around them. The gravity chamber connects to a longer tradition in Dragon Ball Z of characters using environmental extremes as training tools. King Kai's planet offered 10 times Earth's gravity, and Goku adapted to it over months. The hyperbolic time chamber offered 150 times Earth's gravity, in addition to its temporal properties. Gradual escalation of physical challenge was the central methodology of power growth in the series, and the gravity chamber represented Vegeta's attempt to compress that escalation into the shortest possible time frame on his own terms. There is something quietly revealing about the fact that Vegeta built his version of this tool at Capsule Corporation, his wife Bulma's family home. A Saiyan prince, heir to a destroyed world, former servant of the tyrant who had killed his people, training in the backyard of his wife's parents' house in a room powered by technology her family had built. The collision of those realities is one of the stranger and quieter things about the middle era of Dragon Ball Z, rarely commented upon but always present in the background of the story. Planet Namek, the distant world that became the setting for one of the most extended and celebrated arcs in Dragon Ball Z, is described in the series as a planet orbiting a system with 3 suns. This means that Namek experiences no full nights in the conventional sense, with at least one of its 3 suns visible in the sky at almost any given time. The planet exists in a state of near-constant pale light, its sky perpetually tinted in soft blues and greens, its surface covered in the gentle grassy plains that the show used as the backdrop for some of the most intense confrontations in anime history. The Namekian people evolved in this environment over an enormous span of time, developing a biology and a culture shaped by the constant availability of light and the specific properties of their world. Namekians do not eat food in the conventional sense. Their biology is sustained entirely by water, which they absorb from the planet's plentiful natural sources. This is a detail that Toriyama established carefully and that has remained consistent across the canonical material ever since, separating Namekians from virtually every other species in the Dragon Ball universe, in terms of basic biological need. The 3-sun system also explains aspects of the planet's geography. Namek is not a dark or brooding world. It is open, luminous, and almost pastoral when it is not being consumed by war. The warriors of Frieza's army descend onto it like a storm arriving over a meadow. The contrast between the planet's quiet nature and the violence being done to it, giving the Namek saga a particular visual texture that distinguished it from the Earth-based conflicts of the first arc. The Namekian villages scattered across the planet's surface were small, peaceful communities of beings who had built their civilization in relative isolation over countless generations. They had no contact with the wider galaxy. They were not a spacefaring people by the time Frieza arrived. They had their Dragon Balls, their natural world, and their community, and all 3 were under threat simultaneously from the moment Frieza's scouters located the planet's coordinates and the Empire began its descent. The Dragon Balls of Namek were larger than those of Earth, significantly so, roughly the size of basketballs compared to Earth's roughly softball-sized spheres. They were also more powerful in their capacity to grant wishes, offering a meaningfully different set of rules that shaped the entire strategic situation of the Namek arc. Earth's Dragon Balls, created by Kami and later by Dende, could grant 3 wishes but were limited in scope by the power of their creator. The Namekian Dragon Balls, empowered by the Great Elder Guru, had a greater overall ceiling of ability. Critically, Porunga, the Namekian eternal dragon summoned by the Namekian Dragon Balls, could revive multiple people at once per wish, rather than being limited to a single resurrection as Shenron was during this period of the series. This difference in capacity was not incidental. It was the reason the Z fighters needed to reach Namek at all. Shenron had already been used to make various wishes, and the limitations of Earth's Dragon Balls meant that some of the revivifications the heroes needed, specifically the restoration of multiple warriors killed by Nappa and Vegeta, required either waiting or finding an alternative. Namek represented that alternative, and the difference between Purunga's 3-at-once resurrection capacity and Shenron's 1-at-a-time limitation drove much of the plot forward. The Namekian Dragon Balls also required the wish to be spoken in the Namekian language to be activated, which added a specific constraint that the non-Namekian members of the cast had to navigate carefully. Vegeta, who spent considerable time scheming to use the Dragon Balls for his own wish of immortality, had to contend with not only having them stolen by Frieza, but also with the language requirement that made simply possessing the Dragon Balls insufficient without Namekian cooperation. Porunga's appearance also differed significantly from Shenron's, where Shenron was a traditional long Chinese dragon, sleek, serpentine, golden-eyed. Porunga was muscular, massive, and intensely physical in form, appearing almost like a being that could engage in combat if it wished. The visual difference between the two dragons communicated something about the cultures that had created them. Shenron embodying a kind of ethereal grace, Porunga embodying something more raw and elemental, even in the act of granting peaceful wishes. The Kamehameha is the most recognizable technique in Dragon Ball Z, perhaps in all of anime. The cupped hands, the gathering of blue energy, the shout of the name as the beam releases. It is an image that has appeared on millions of pieces of merchandise, in countless parody videos, in the hands of people around the world who have never seen a single episode of the show. It is perhaps the most culturally transmitted single moment in the history of animated action series. What is quiet and often forgotten is that the Kamehameha was not invented by Goku. It was invented by Master Roshi, an elderly man who, despite his eccentric personality and his somewhat unserious public presentation, spent 50 years developing and perfecting the technique before Goku ever saw it for the first time. 50 years is a span of time that the show states plainly and then moves past, but it is worth sitting with. A technique that Goku seemed to reproduce almost casually in his first attempt had consumed half a century of its creator's deliberate, painstaking work. Goku's ability to replicate the Kamehameha almost immediately upon seeing it for the first time was identified early as a sign of his extraordinary potential. Master Roshi himself was visibly startled. The technique is not designed to be reproducible on first observation. It requires an understanding of ki manipulation, of gathering and releasing energy in a specific way that takes most practitioners years to approximate even imperfectly. That Goku did it at all, let alone correctly, was a moment that told the audience something fundamental about who this child was, even before they had the full context to understand what that meant. Over the course of Dragon Ball Z, the Kamehameha evolved in the hands of multiple users. Gohan eventually learned it. Krillin developed variations of it. The technique itself became a kind of living tradition, passed from Roshi to Goku to the next generation, carried forward through family and training in a way that quietly mirrors the biological inheritance of Saiyan potential. In its final and most emotionally resonant appearance in Dragon Ball Z, the technique becomes the instrument of a moment between a father and the son. But that story belongs to a later section of tonight's journey. One of the most significant revelations of the Namek Saga, and one that reframed everything that had come before it, was the disclosure that Frieza had been operating in suppressed transformations almost the entire time the audience had known him. The tyrant who had eliminated entire species, who had destroyed planet Vegeta, who had reduced Vegeta and Krillin to barely functional fighters, was not fighting at his actual capacity. He was operating at a fraction of what he was genuinely capable of, and the reason for this was not weakness. It was control. Frieza's power in his first form, the form in which he first appeared on Namek, carried in a levitation pod, directing his forces with calm authority, was already far beyond anything the heroes could easily challenge. When he transformed into his second form during the battle against Gohan, Krillin, and Vegeta, his power increased so dramatically that Vegeta's reaction alone, a Saiyan prince who had never visibly feared anything, communicated to the audience that they had not yet seen the full picture of what this villain could do. There were 4 forms in total, each one more powerful than the last, and the logic behind them was counterintuitive in a way that revealed something important about Frieza's nature. His original base form was actually his most powerful. The transformations before the final one were not power-ups in the conventional sense, they were power containment systems, bodies of reduced capacity that Frieza used to manage a level of energy that his own will found difficult to control in its raw, unstructured form. The transformations were suppressions, not escalations, until the final form, which was the original. His final form, slender, pale, almost serene in its economy of design, was described as the most terrifying shape any living being in the universe had ever taken at that point in the story. Toriyama designed it as a deliberate inversion of expectation. The most powerful form would not be the largest, most elaborate, or most monstrous. It would be the simplest, the most controlled, the one that looked almost calm. This same philosophy would eventually inform the design and concept of several future transformations across Dragon Ball Z and beyond. The idea that true power sometimes expresses itself through restraint and simplicity rather than size and visual intensity. Frieza's final form established a precedent that the series returned to quietly over and over again, sometimes consciously and sometimes simply as an inheritance from the moment it first appeared on screen. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The Red Ribbon Army was a villain organization from the original Dragon Ball series, a militaristic force led by a man named Commander Red, whose secret motivation for seeking the Dragon Balls was shockingly personal and almost pitiable when revealed. The army was defeated by Goku in the original series before Dragon Ball Z ever began, and by the time the Z era opened, they were a memory, a chapter of history closed and set aside, or so it seemed. Dr. Gero, the chief scientist of the Red Ribbon Army, had survived the army's destruction. He spent the years following that defeat, in secret working on a project that would take everything Gero understood about science, about biology, and about revenge, and combine them into a series of creations that would eventually threaten the entire planet. The androids, the artificial warriors who formed the central thread of the arc that bore their name, were the Red Ribbon Army's final and most devastating weapon, produced by a man who had waited years for the right moment. This connection between the original series' villain organization and the androids' arc of Dragon Ball Z is one of the more elegant pieces of long-range storytelling in the franchise. Toriyama had established Dr. Gero in the original series as a background figure, a name attached to the Army's scientific achievements. By the time Dragon Ball Z brought him fully to the foreground, the audience who had been paying attention had all the context they needed. The Red Ribbon Army never truly ended, it simply went underground, bided its time, and came back in a form no one had anticipated. Dr. Gero's decision to transform himself into an android, Android 20, is one of the stranger choices in Dragon Ball Z, and it reflects the depth of his obsession with the project. He was not content to simply build weapons. He wanted to be part of what he had created. He converted his own brain into a computer, preserved himself in a mechanical body, and joined the line of androids as their creator become member. The result was a being whose hatred of Goku had been running for so long that it had become something structural, not emotion anymore, but architecture. The androids created by Dr. Gero are numbered, and those numbers tell a story that the series itself never fully explains in dialogue. The most prominent androids in Dragon Ball Z are 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, the last of which is Gero himself. This means that at least 15 other android models existed before the ones the audience encounters, and the fate of most of them is left almost entirely to implication. In supplementary materials and background references within the show, Some information about earlier models is available. Android 16, for example, was an entirely original design, a large, gentle mechanical being who bore a physical resemblance to Gero's lost son, a young man who had been killed in combat years before the events of Dragon Ball Z. The model number and the design speak to a kind of private grief that Gero encoded into the project alongside his desire for revenge, a monument to a child built inside a weapon created for destruction. Androids 8 and 13 through 15 appear in non-canonical films from the Dragon Ball Z movie lineup, filling in some of the numerical gap with their own stories. But the canonical accounting of the Android series leaves large sections of the lineage unexplained, which is itself a kind of narrative texture. The sense that Gero's laboratory had been operating for a very long time, producing things that the audience never got to see, driven by a purpose that had been running long before Goku and his friends ever became aware of it. 17 and 18 are particularly interesting in the context of their origins. They were not built from scratch. They were formerly human beings, a brother and sister who were kidnapped and converted by Gero against their will. This is established in the series and carries with it an implication that the show never lingers on, but that changes how the two characters can be understood. They are not machines who sometimes seem human. They are human beings who have been partially replaced, who retain their original personalities, their preferences, their wills, and who resent the transformation they did not choose. 18's eventual integration into Krillin's family, her marriage to him, the birth of their daughter Marin, is in this light a kind of reclamation. A life that was interrupted and restructured by violence finds its way towards something gentle and chosen. The series treats it simply, without ceremony, but the backstory beneath it is anything but simple. It is the story of a person finding their way back to something like an ordinary life, after being turned into something they never agreed to become. Future Trunks is one of the most carefully constructed characters in Dragon Ball Z, and the time travel mechanics that define his story are more internally consistent than they might appear on first viewing. He arrives from a future that is already ruined, a world in which Goku died from a previously existing heart disease, the other Z fighters were killed one by the androids, and the androids spent more than a decade devastating what remained of human civilization. This is the future Trunks grew up in. It is the only world he has ever known. The timeline logic that Dragon Ball Z establishes around Trunks operates on a branching model. When Trunks travels back in time and warns Goku about the android threat, and when Goku and the others prepare accordingly, they are not saving Trunks' future. They are creating a new branch of history, a separate timeline in which the preparation changes the outcome. Trunks' own future remains as devastated as it was when he left it. He goes home to a world that his trip backward in time could not retroactively fix. This is a detail that the show handles with more honesty than many time travel narratives manage. Trunks does not save himself. He saves others in a timeline that is not his own, spending his effort improving a future he will never live in permanently, knowing that the world he goes home to is still broken. There is something in that structure, the sacrifice of a person who does good they will never personally benefit from, that runs quietly beneath all of his most celebrated moments. Future Trunks returned to his own time after the Cell Games, with knowledge, experience, and a power level vastly greater than what he had left with. In his timeline, he defeated his version of the androids in Cell relatively quickly, and then there was no further threat, no further urgency, no Dragon Ball Z continuing in that branch of history. Just a young man standing in a world that was beginning, slowly, to heal. The show doesn't show that moment. It is left to the imagination, which may be the most appropriate place for it to live. The hyperbolic time chamber, known in the original Japanese as the Room of Spirit and Time, is one of the most conceptually striking locations in Dragon Ball Z. It exists within the Lookout, the floating platform where the Earth's guardian resides high above the clouds. Its exterior entrance is an ordinary door in an ordinary room. Its interior is something else entirely. Inside the chamber, time moves at a ratio of 1 year inside for every 1 day that passes in the outside world. A warrior who enters and remains for an Earth Day will emerge having experienced a full year. The maximum total time that any person is permitted to spend inside the chamber is 2 years, after which the door will no longer open for that person and they cannot re-enter. This is not a mechanical limitation, but something built into the nature of the space itself, an absolute constraint whose logic the show does not fully explain, and perhaps does not need to. The environment inside the chamber is extreme in almost every physical dimension. The gravity is 150 times that of Earth's surface. The temperature swings between extremes that would be fatal to most ordinary beings. The air near the entrance is breathable, but the air near the edges of the space, which extend infinitely in all directions, the chamber having no visible walls, becomes increasingly hostile to biological life. There is food available near the entrance, but venturing far from it risks becoming lost in a space that has no landmarks, no horizon, no reference points by which to navigate back. Goku and Gohan were the first to use the chamber during the Cell arc, spending their year inside pushing past the boundaries of the Super Saiyan transformation and arriving at what would be called the full power Super Saiyan state, a form in which the muscular tension and energy expenditure of the standard Super Saiyan transformation is reduced to nearly nothing, making the power accessible in a natural, sustainable way rather than as a constant exertion. This was the insight that the year inside the chamber produced, and it changed the strategic calculus of the Cell games entirely. Vegeta and Trunks also spent time in the chamber. Their experience was different. Both of them pushed beyond the full power state and discovered what became known as the Ultra Super Saiyan form, a transformation of dramatically increased muscle mass and raw power, but with a critical cost. The Ultra Super Saiyan's speed was severely reduced by the weight of its own musculature, making it powerful in a strictly technical sense while being functionally inferior in actual combat to the full-power Super Saiyan form that Goku and Gohan had developed. Vegeta recognized this limitation. The recognition did not improve his mood. Cell is one of the most conceptually unusual antagonists in Dragon Ball Z, and his design reflects a degree of creative ambition that Toriyama rarely attempted so directly. Cell is a bio-android, a being grown from a combination of the DNA of multiple warriors, assembled in a laboratory by Dr. Gero and, crucially, by Dr. Gero's supercomputer, which continued developing Cell long after Gero himself had ceased to be involved in the project. The genetic contributors to Cell's composition include Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, Frieza, and King Cold, among others. This means Cell is simultaneously the child of the series hero, its recurring villain, its most complex anti-hero, and the tyrant who destroyed an entire planet. A being whose very cells contain the history of Dragon Ball Z compressed into a single body. Toriyama designed this composition partly as a storytelling device, explaining why Cell could replicate many of the techniques and transformations associated with the warriors whose DNA he carried. But it also gives Cell a strange relationship to the rest of the cast. He is, in a biological sense, related to almost all of them. Cell's 3 transformations, his initial imperfect form, his semi-perfect form achieved by absorbing Android 17, and his perfect form achieved by absorbing Android 18, each carry a distinct visual character. His first form is insectoid and deeply unsettling. His semi-perfect form is more humanoid but visibly unstable. His perfect form is sleek, symmetrical, and almost beautiful in its classical sense, as though completion had resolved every previous roughness into something clean and controlled. Toriyama has noted that he based Perfect Cell's visual aesthetic partly on the look of a conventional superhero, which makes the character even more unsettling in context. The monster had chosen to wear the face of a hero. Cell's regeneration ability, drawn from Piccolo's DNA, is one of the most consequential biological details in the Cell arc. After Goku teleports Cell away from Earth at the moment of Cell's self-destruction, sacrificing himself to prevent the explosion from destroying the planet, Cell regenerates from a single surviving cell. This ability was inherited directly from Piccolo, whose Namekian biology allows for reconstruction from minimal remaining tissue. Cell survived not because of any power level calculation, but because of a piece of Namekian genetics that no one had specifically prepared for. He also powered up significantly from the experience of that near death, drawing on the Saiyan genetic material within him, specifically Zenkai ability, the Saiyan biological trait that causes power to increase dramatically after surviving injury that approaches the threshold of death. Cell came back from his self-destruction not only alive but stronger. These details were built into the character from his concept, and they pay off with a quiet kind of logic that rewards attention to everything that came before. Gohan's arc in Dragon Ball Z is one of the most debated elements of the series among longtime fans, and part of that debate stems from a documented piece of creative history that Toriyama has referenced in various interviews over the years. When Toriyama was developing the Cell arc, he intended for Gohan to become the new central protagonist of the series going forward, to take Goku's place not temporarily, but permanently, representing the next generation of the story's heroic lineage. The power that Gohan displays during the Cell games, the Super Saiyan 2 transformation, triggered by the death of Android 16 and the cruelty of Cell's behavior toward the Z fighters, was designed as the handing over of the series' protagonist role from father to son. Goku's decision to stay dead after the Cell games, choosing not to be revived because he believed his presence attracted danger to the people around him, was part of this plan. The torch was meant to change. This shift never fully materialized. Reader feedback to the manga during serialization indicated a strong preference for Goku to remain the central character, and Toriyama adjusted accordingly. The Buu saga brought Goku back to the center of the story, and while Gohan remained important, his role shifted from protagonist to supporting figure in ways that the story's internal logic occasionally struggled to accommodate. The extraordinary power that had been built up in him, the latent potential that multiple characters explicitly identified as exceeding even Goku's, was never fully developed in the direction the Cell arc had suggested it would be. Gohan's power during the Cell games is worth pausing on regardless of what happened afterward. When he transforms into Super Saiyan 2, the first character in the series to reach this form, the transformation carries a physical intensity that the animation studio clearly understood was meant to be a definitive moment. The electrical discharge, the calm that follows the explosion of energy, the shift in his eyes from fighting anger to something colder and more precise. These are visual choices that communicate something the story was trying to say about what it means when a gentle person reaches the absolute limit of what they will tolerate. Cell pushed Gohan past that limit deliberately, after Gohan had explained to him that he did not want to fight. It is one of the more psychologically pointed exchanges in the series. A villain who understood that his opponent's full power could only be unlocked through suffering, and who chose to create that suffering deliberately. The result was a power the villain could not handle, expressed by a character who had never wanted to be a fighter in the first place. There is something in that contradiction that makes the moment resonant in a way that a straightforward display of power never quite achieves on its own. The final confrontation between Cell and Gohan in the Cell games is among the most emotionally complex moments in Dragon Ball Z, and it arrives not through a singular technique, but through an accumulation of small choices that each build on what came before. Cell, in his self-destructed and regenerated form, fires a Kamehameha of concentrated power directly at Gohan. Gohan, whose right arm had been severely injured earlier in the fight, begins to charge his own Kamehameha in response. In the afterlife, Goku watches through King Kai's ability to observe living events. He speaks to Gohan, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the ordinary voice of a father saying something true. He tells his son that he has always been stronger than he believed himself to be. He tells him to let it go, to stop holding back, to stop managing the power, to simply let everything that is in him come forward. And then, in a visual sequence that the series presents with extraordinary restraint, Goku's energy joins Gohan's from across the boundary between life and death. This is not a technique, exactly. The father-son Kamehameha, as it came to be known, is not described in any formal way within the episode itself. Goku does not explain what he is doing, Gohan does not acknowledge receiving anything. The effect simply occurs. Gohan's Kamehameha grows in a way that cannot be accounted for by his own power alone, and the beam overcomes cells with a gradual, grinding intensity that takes several minutes of screen time and that feels appropriately weighted for everything it is trying to contain. Vegeta's contribution in this sequence is rarely discussed, but it matters. As Gohan struggles to maintain his Kamehameha against cells, Vegeta fires a ki blast at Cell from the side. A distraction, a disruption, an act from a character who had been at odds with Gohan and his father throughout the series, who had every reason to let events unfold without his interference, and who chose instead to act. It is perhaps the single most quietly significant act of solidarity that Vegeta performs in all of Dragon Ball Z, and the show presents it with almost no fanfare at all. He fires. Gohan uses the opening, and the moment passes as though it were ordinary. After the Cell Games, the Dragon Balls were used to revive the people who had been killed during Cell's campaign of destruction. But Goku was not an oversight. It was Goku's own choice, communicated during the sequence in which he instructed Gohan on how to complete the Kamehameha. He had decided in the time between his death and that moment that he would not return. His reasoning, as he explains it, is both simple and difficult to argue with on its own terms. Goku observes that dangerous enemies have been drawn to Earth repeatedly over the years, and that these enemies consistently targeted either him directly or the people around him in order to reach him. He concludes that his absence from Earth removes a specific vector of threat, that the world may be safer without him physically present in it. He chooses to remain in the afterlife, not as a punishment and not as a sacrifice, in the dramatic sense, but as a practical decision made by someone who has thought carefully about consequences. This reasoning has been a source of some reflection among fans of the series for decades, partly because it is logically imperfect. Threats continued to emerge in Goku's absence, as the Buu saga eventually demonstrated, and partly because it represents a choice that is, for a protagonist, unusually disengaged from the ongoing story. Goku removes himself from the narrative. He places the responsibility on those he leaves behind. He trusts his son and his friends in a way that is admirable in spirit, but complex in its practical implications. For a full 7 years between the end of the Cell Saga and the beginning of the Buu Saga, Goku trained in the afterlife while his son grew up, his friends aged and changed, and the world moved forward without him. It is one of the stranger gaps in the central character's story arc, and it shaped who Gohan became in the years the show doesn't show in real time. A young man growing up in the shadow of an absent father whose absence was chosen rather than forced, carrying that complexity forward into everything he did. The transition from the Cell Saga to the Buu Saga represents the largest single time jump within Dragon Ball Z itself. 7 years of story that happened entirely off-screen, communicated only through the changes visible in the characters when the show picks the story back up. These 7 years reshaped the cast in ways that the show trusts the audience to absorb quickly, without extensive explanation. Gohan is the most dramatically changed. He is 17 years old when the Buu saga begins, a high school student attending a school in the city near his home, keeping his identity secret, navigating the complicated social landscape of adolescence while possessing the capacity to destroy mountains. His Super Saiyan transformation, which the Cell Games had established as something extraordinary, is now something he uses carefully and quietly when needed, hiding it from classmates in the same way he might hide an embarrassing family secret. Krillin has married Android 18, and they have a daughter named Marin together. This is presented matter-of-factly, as though it is the most natural thing in the world, that a human martial artist and a partially cybernetic being, who was once a weapon of mass destruction, are raising a child in a suburban home. The relationship works because 18's fundamental humanity survived her conversion largely intact. Krillin fell in love with a person, not a machine. The machine just happened to be part of the same package. Goku, meanwhile, has spent the 7 years in the afterlife training. When he is granted one day to return to Earth for the World Martial Arts Tournament, his return is treated with quiet significance by everyone around him. He meets his youngest son Goten for the first time, a child born after his father's death, now 7 years old. The spitting image of Goku in a way that the show presents as both charming and slightly eerie. A small child carrying a face the world associates with its greatest warrior, growing up in a house where that warrior was absent and present only in memory. Majin Buu is, in terms of the history that the Dragon Ball Z narrative establishes, not a recently created threat. He is ancient in a way that few things in the series are, a being whose origins predate most of the other historical events referenced in the show, created by a wizard named BBD millions of years before the events of Dragon Ball Z began. That span of time is staggering. The conflict with Frieza, which shaped the galactic political landscape of the series, was measured in decades. The history of the Dragon Balls was measured in centuries. Buu predates all of it by a margin that the show states, but never quite lingers on. Bibidi used Buu as a weapon, directing him against the Supreme Kais, the divine overseers of the universe, and very nearly succeeded in eliminating that entire divine hierarchy. 2 of the 5 Supreme Kais were killed outright. 2 more were absorbed by Buu, their power and personalities becoming part of the composite being. Only the last Supreme Kai, the one who appears in the Buu arc as the wizened elder figure, survived, and he did so by managing to seal Buu inside a cocoon and transport it to a remote corner of the universe where it could be contained. Bibidi was killed shortly after this sealing was accomplished, and his containment of Buu's cocoon was maintained by the surviving Supreme Kai for millions of years. It was Bibidi's son Babidi, a diminutive but devious figure whose name echoes his father's almost as a dark joke, who eventually tracked down the cocoon and set in motion the events that led to Buu's release. Babidi possessed the same magical ability as his father to control beings by drawing out the latent darkness within them, a technique he used on Vegeta with memorable consequences during the arc. The Buu that emerges from the cocoon after millions of years of containment is not the most powerful version of the character. He is, in fact, one of the weaker ones, his power having been substantially reduced by the absorption of the 2 Supreme Kais during Bibidi's original campaign. The Fat Buu retains the personalities of those absorbed Kais in a way that makes him simultaneously terrifying and strangely innocent, a being of extraordinary destructive potential, who finds genuine pleasure in things as simple as a sunny afternoon and a piece of candy. The contradiction between what Buu is capable of and how he actually behaves in his early appearances is one of the more unusual character conceits in the series. The various forms that Majin Buu takes across the arc that bears his name are not arbitrary. They each represent a different configuration of the personalities and power levels accumulated through millions of years of history. Understanding what each form contains helps explain why the strategic situation shifts so dramatically as the arc progresses. Fat Buu, the first form the audience encounters, is the product of Buu's original power being partially diluted by the absorption of the Grand Supreme Kai, the most senior and most kindly of the 5 original Supreme Kais. The Grand Supreme Kai's gentle nature suppressed much of Buu's fundamental evil, producing a being that is childlike, impulsive, and capable of both extraordinary destruction and unexpected compassion. When Fat Buu meets Hercule, the world martial arts champion, the relationship that develops between them is one of the quietly touching elements of the arc. Hercule treats Buu with warmth and without fear, and Buu responds to this warmth with genuine attachment. Evil Buu emerges when Buu's suppressed dark nature is finally provoked beyond what the Grand Supreme Kai's influence can contain. He takes a separate physical form, thin, gray, intensely dangerous, and the 2 halves of the character fight each other in a sequence that is visually striking precisely because it makes external a psychological conflict that had been running invisibly beneath Buu's cheerful surface. Evil Buu wins. He absorbs Fat Buu and becomes Super Buu, a being who combines the power of both halves with a personality that is actively malicious, intelligent, and deeply deliberate. Kid Buu, the purest form that emerges after all the absorptions are removed, is presented as more dangerous than any of the previous versions, despite being significantly smaller. What makes Kid Buu uniquely dangerous is the complete absence of any restraining influence. Every absorption that diluted his evil, every piece of a Kai or a hero that had been folded into his makeup and had, in its small way, softened something, is gone. What remains is the original Buu, ancient, mindless, joyful in destruction, and without any capacity for the hesitation or negotiation that had made previous forms navigable. He is not stronger exactly. He is simply more completely himself. Dragon Ball Z introduces two distinct methods of fusion during the Buu arc, and the differences between them are specific and carry meaningful narrative implications. The fusion dance, taught to Goku during his one-day return to Earth, requires two participants of nearly identical power levels and nearly identical physical size. If either condition is imperfectly met, the resulting fused being is compromised, either obese and weak or skeletal and frail, a failure state that the show demonstrates at length through Gotenks' early fusion attempts. The precision required by the fusion dance is absolute. The hand positions, the step sequence, the timing, every element must be matched exactly between two people moving simultaneously. A single deviation produces a wrong result. This precision is designed as the technique's equalizing limitation. It is available to anyone who can learn it. But it demands a kind of synchronized discipline that is not easy to achieve under the pressure of combat conditions or the enthusiasm of a young child who has never done anything precisely in his life. The Potara earrings offer a contrasting method, a fusion of divine origin used by the Supreme Kais themselves that requires only the matching of two earrings, one worn on each of two individuals' opposite ears. There is no physical precision requirement. There is no power level matching demand. The fusion simply occurs, producing a being that is generally understood to be superior to what the fusion dance produces from the same two individuals. The fused being that Goku and Vegeta produce through the Potara earrings, Vegito, is presented as perhaps the most powerful character in Dragon Ball Z to that point. A being who combines the Saiyan potential of both individuals and whose personality is an interesting blend of their respective natures, playful where Goku is earnest, controlled where Vegeta is intense, confident in a way that belongs to neither one individually, but emerges from their combination. Vegito toys with Super Buu in a way that no previous character had been able to, maintaining an almost serene confidence throughout a confrontation that should by any measure be deeply dangerous. Gotenks, the fusion of Goten and Trunks through the fusion dance, is one of the most unusual characters in Dragon Ball Z's final arc, a being whose personality does not reflect either of his component individuals accurately, but instead produces something distinctly its own. Where Goten is warm and relatively easygoing, and Trunks is confident and strategic, Gotenks is flamboyant, theatrical, and possessed of a self-regard that is almost comedic in its extremity given that he is, chronologically, somewhere between 7 and 8 years old. The power level of Gotenks is presented as extraordinary. Even at the base fusion level, he is capable of fighting Super Buu with some effectiveness, and in his Super Saiyan 3 form inside the hyperbolic time chamber, he genuinely troubles the villain in ways that the individual fighters available at that point in the arc could not. The show treats this seriously even while the character himself refuses to treat anything seriously. Gotenks invents elaborate named attacks with theatrical titles, the Galactic Donut, the Super Ghost Kamikaze attack, and delivers them with the enthusiasm of someone who has spent considerable time thinking about what it would be like to be a superhero. The Super Ghost Kamikaze attack is worth a brief pause in itself. It involves Gotenks producing sentient ghosts from his mouth, beings that explode on contact and that possess enough individual consciousness to be directed and to express personality. It is one of the stranger canonical techniques in Dragon Ball Z, existing somewhere between an actual attack and a conceptual art piece, and it works, which somehow makes it stranger rather than less strange. Gotenks' limitation is his fusion time. The fusion dance produces a fusion that lasts exactly 30 minutes before reverting to the two individuals. Inside the hyperbolic time chamber where time moves differently, This limitation was managed carefully. Outside the chamber, during the continuation of the battle, the 30-minute clock became a genuine strategic constraint. The eventual separation of Gotenks at a critical moment in the fight against Super Buu, reverting to two children at exactly the wrong moment, changed the course of the battle significantly, and not for the better. Hercule, known in the original Japanese as Mr. Satan, is a character who exists in Dragon Ball Z primarily as comic relief for most of the series. He is the world martial arts champion, the strongest non-powered human being in the show's world, a legitimate achievement. But he exists in a fictional context where that achievement means almost nothing in combat terms compared to the warriors who actually determine the fate of the planet. He claims credit for victories he had nothing to do with, and he is presented throughout as a figure of gentle, affectionate mockery. And then, in the Buu arc, something happens that reframes everything. Hercule forms a genuine friendship with Fat Buu. He approaches the monster with kindness when every tactical consideration would suggest the opposite approach. He talks to Buu without fear, not because he is entirely unafraid, but because he has committed to the interaction and doesn't have any other tools available. And Buu, who has destroyed cities and killed populations, responds to this kindness with something that reads unmistakably as genuine affection. This friendship has direct consequences on the arc's outcome. When Buu is eventually manipulated by Babidi's influence, it is Hercule's direct intervention, specifically his friendship with Buu and the presence of a small dog Buu had also come to care for, that creates the conditions for Fat Buu's eventual split from Evil Buu. The emotional lever that changed the course of the Buu arc was not a power technique or a transformation. It was a friendship that nobody had expected to mean anything. At the very end of the arc, during the final battle against Kid Buu on the sacred world of the Kais, it is Hercule who persuades the living people of the restored Earth to lend their energy to Goku's Spirit Bomb. When all other approaches have failed, the Spirit Bomb requires willing energy from living beings. Earth's people do not know Goku. They have no reason to trust a voice from the sky, but Hercule they know, Hercule they trust. When he speaks to them and asks them to do as the voice instructs, they listen. The Spirit Bomb that destroys Kid Buu is as much Hercule's achievement as Goku's. The Spirit Bomb is one of the most conceptually interesting techniques in Dragon Ball Z, and its rules, once understood, make the final battle against Kid Buu considerably more emotionally layered than a straightforward power comparison. Goku learned the Spirit Bomb from King Kai during his training on the small planet at the end of Snake Way, and King Kai presented it as the ultimate technique, not because of its raw power alone, but because of what it required to function at all. The Spirit Bomb gathers ambient life energy from every willing living thing within its range. A plant contributes what it can. A small animal contributes what it can. A conscious being can contribute more deliberately. The gathered energy is then compressed and directed by the user toward the target. The critical constraint is that the technique requires time, significant extended time, to gather sufficient energy for any meaningful application. It cannot be used quickly. It cannot be used in the midst of rapid combat. It is a weapon of patience, requiring an opponent to either be immobilized or to allow the gathering to proceed for reasons of their own. A further constraint is that the Spirit Bomb will not harm a being with a pure heart. It will pass through or deflect away from such a being rather than causing damage. This is why the technique works so definitively against Kid Buu. Buu's evil is so complete, so fundamental, so entirely constitutive of his nature that the Spirit Bomb finds no resistance within him of the kind it would find in a being with any remaining goodness. The technique and the target are, in a sense, perfectly matched. The gathering of the Spirit Bomb during the Kid Buu fight required planetary resources, energy from the restored Earth and the living beings on it. Goku could not gather enough from just the beings present on the sacred world of the Kais. He needed more. Hercule's intervention made the collection possible. Vegeta's decision to keep Kid Buu occupied while the gathering proceeded, fighting a losing battle against an opponent he could not defeat, sustained only by the willingness to continue, was what gave the process enough time to complete. Each piece of the final victory is a collaborative contribution. Vegeta's arc across Dragon Ball Z is in many ways the series' most sustained and complex character study, a portrait of a being whose pride was both his greatest strength and the source of almost every meaningful failure in his life. He arrived as a villain. He became an anti-hero. He never quite completed the transition to something simpler or more comfortable, remaining throughout in a complicated middle space that made him one of its most compelling and most watched figures. His decision at the end of the Kid Buu battle, the decision to stand aside and allow Goku to make the spirit bomb rather than insisting on fighting himself, is the culmination of this arc. Vegeta is not capable of making the spirit bomb work. He does not have what is required for it. But more than that, he has spent the last portion of the fight acknowledging something that his pride spent the entire series resisting. That Goku is better, not just stronger but better, in the specific way that matters in this specific moment. The Saiyan prince who arrived on Earth declaring himself the strongest being in the universe spends the final battle of Dragon Ball Z providing cover for a man he spent years despising. He does not say much about it. Vegeta rarely explains himself, but the action communicates what the words don't. He holds Kid Buu. He falls, he gets back up, he falls again. He keeps getting up, not because the outcome of his individual fight is meaningful, but because every additional second he can buy is a second that the spirit bomb gets to charge. It is the most quietly generous thing Vegeta ever does, rendered in the visual language of a man who would never allow anyone to call it generosity. There is also a moment before Goku releases the spirit bomb where Vegeta contributes his remaining energy, whatever Vegeta has left, given directly, folded into the technique that Vegeta could never use himself. A Saiyan prince who once called Goku a low-class warrior, who resented every step of Goku's development, who defined himself in opposition to everything Goku represented, offering the last of his energy so that Goku can end it. The series doesn't linger on this moment. It doesn't need to. The moment carries itself. The Kaioken is a technique that Goku learns from King Kai during his training in the afterlife before the Saiyan Saga, and it operates on a principle of concentrated expenditure, a way of multiplying the body's power, speed, and endurance by a specific factor for a limited duration at the cost of enormous physical strain. At its standard level, the Kaioken doubles these attributes. At higher multiples, times 3, times 4, times 10, the multiplications become more extreme, but so does the toll on the body that is producing them. King Kai established the Kaioken as fundamentally dangerous from the beginning. It is not a transformation in the sense of a stable power state that the user can maintain indefinitely. It is a temporary override of the body's natural limitations, forcing output that the body is not designed to sustain. At lower multiples, a healthy Saiyan body can manage this for reasonable periods. At higher multiples, the times 20 that Goku used against Frieza, for example, the survival of the technique's use is itself remarkable, a function of Saiyan resilience rather than any design intention of the technique itself. The Kaioken was a constant feature of the early Dragon Ball Z battles, and then it faded as the Super Saiyan transformation emerged and provided a more stable means of power amplification. But its existence in the series establishes something important about how the show conceptualized power, as something that could be temporarily forced beyond its natural ceiling, but always with consequences, always with a cost that the body would eventually present. Nothing in Dragon Ball Z's power system is free. Every significant increase in output corresponds to a cost paid somewhere, in time, in physical damage, in the risk of something that cannot be repaired. The special beam cannon, known in the original Japanese as the Makamko Sappo, is the technique with which Piccolo kills both Raditz and himself in the opening battle of Dragon Ball Z. It is the first truly dangerous technique the audience encounters in the series, and its power is sufficient to kill a Saiyan of Raditz's caliber, which establishes early the scale of threat that the incoming Saiyan warriors would represent. What the show mentions but does not linger on is the development time for the technique. Piccolo spent 5 years creating and perfecting the special beam cannon before he used it against Raditz. 5 years of deliberate, focused effort to develop a single attack, a drilling beam of concentrated ki that pierces through targets rather than destroying them from the outside. Designed specifically to overcome defenses that conventional ki blasts cannot penetrate. 5 years is a commitment of such scale that it speaks to Piccolo's thoroughness and discipline in a way that his battle personality rarely pauses to reveal. The technique's first use, against Raditz, requires a charging time that creates the central problem of the battle. Raditz is fast enough to dodge the attack when it is telegraphed, which is why Goku has to hold him in place while Piccolo charges. The charging time is reduced in later uses, presumably as Piccolo's mastery of the technique improves. But the early version demonstrates clearly that the most dangerous techniques are not necessarily the most immediately available ones. 5 years of development, one battle to demonstrate it, and then, within the same battle, Piccolo fires it knowing that Goku is in the path of the technique and will die along with Raditz. It is the first death in Dragon Ball Z, and it is partially the result of a weapon that its creator had spent years preparing. The quiet weight of that sits beneath the episode in a way that becomes more visible the longer you think about it. The Lookout, the platform in the sky where Kami lived, and later where Dende would serve as the Earth's guardian, is one of the quieter, more consistent locations in Dragon Ball Z, a place that appears repeatedly across the series as a gathering point where characters receive information, prepare for battles, and access the chamber beneath the platform. It sits high above the clouds, accessible only by flight, suspended over the world in a way that gives it a natural remove from the urgency of the events happening below. Mr. Popo, the dark, rotund figure who serves as the Lookout's attendant, has lived there for an enormous span of time, training guardians, maintaining the space, possessing a level of power that the show consistently implies is greater than his surface personality would suggest. He trained Kami. He trained Krillin and the others during their preparation for the Saiyan invasion. He exists as a constant, patient presence in a story full of characters who are never quite still, offering the Lookout as a kind of anchor, a place you can return to and find unchanged regardless of how much the world below has shifted. Dende's appointment as Earth's new guardian, replacing Kami after Kami merged with Piccolo, is a quiet character moment that the show handles with appropriate weight. Dende is young, Namekian brought to Earth by Goku during the Namek Saga, someone who had been a child facing extinction when the heroes first encountered him on his dying planet. By the time he becomes the Earth's guardian, he has grown into someone capable of bearing that responsibility, and his elevation to the role is presented as a natural completion of an arc that began in fear and ends in purpose. The Namekians as a species are one of the more carefully thought-through biological constructs in Dragon Ball Z, with specific characteristics that distinguish them from every other race in the series and that carry internal consistency across all the canonical material. Their green skin and antennae are the most immediately visible markers of their non-human nature, but the deeper biological details are what make them genuinely interesting as a people. Namekians are hermaphroditic and reproduces without a partner, producing eggs through a process that is explained only generally in the series, but that has been elaborated on in supplementary materials. This reproductive biology explains why Namekian communities are exclusively male in presentation. There is no female sex in the species, and reproduction does not require pairing. A Namekian who wishes to create another Namekian can do so alone, expelling an egg that will eventually produce a child who carries the genetic material of the parent. The water-only sustenance of Namekians connects to a broader truth about the species' relationship to their environment. They are creatures of the natural world in a way that most Dragon Ball Z races are not, dependent on one simple, pure resource rather than on the complex nutritional needs of omnivores or carnivores. In a story that is often about enormous power and its application, the Namekians represent a quiet alternative, a people whose biological design emphasizes simplicity and natural sufficiency over accumulation. Their ability to regenerate demonstrated most dramatically in Piccolo but present to varying degrees across the species, is a biological inheritance that carries practical implications in combat but also speaks to a resilience that goes beyond fighting. A Namekian is not easily killed by injuries that would be final for most other beings. They can recover from damage that would otherwise be permanent, a trait that is presented as extraordinary in the context of Earth's biological norms, but that for Namkians is simply how their bodies work. The Zenkai, also known as the Saiyan Power or the Saiyan Zenkai Boost, is one of the most strategically significant biological traits in Dragon Ball Z, and it operates on a principle that is both simple in statement and extraordinary in implication. When a Saiyan survives an injury that nearly kills them, an injury serious enough to bring them to the threshold of death, their body heals, and in the process their power increases substantially. The greater the damage survived, the greater the resulting increase in capacity. This trait is established explicitly during the Saiyan Saga and becomes a recurring tactical element throughout the Namek arc. Vegeta demonstrates it clearly during his battle with Carbon, having lost their first encounter and been healed in a medical tank, returning to the subsequent battle significantly more powerful than he had been before. The increase is not gradual or incremental. It is pronounced, meaningful, and visible to anyone watching closely. The implications of the Zenkai extend beyond individual battles. Saiyans who survive repeated near-death experiences accumulate power increases that compound over time, which helps explain how characters like Goku and Vegeta, who sustain significant damage across many of Dragon Ball Z's conflicts, maintain a growth trajectory that consistently outpaces species who do not share this biological feature. The universe of Dragon Ball Z is, in a biological sense, somewhat designed to produce increasingly powerful Saiyans, not by any external intention, but because the evolutionary pressures of a warrior culture align exactly with the conditions that activate the Zenkai. Goku's enormous growth throughout the series connects to this principle in a way the show doesn't always make explicit. He has nearly died many times. Each time, the healing has been accompanied by a marked increase in capacity. His growth is not purely a function of training, though training contributes. It is also a biological inheritance from a species whose evolution seems almost specifically optimized for surviving conflict and emerging from it stronger than before. Senzu beans are among the most quietly powerful objects in Dragon Ball Z, serving a narrative function that the series handled with more consistency than many similar concepts in other long-running series. They heal injuries completely and restore stamina to full functioning as a kind of instant reset for a character's physical condition. A warrior at the edge of death can eat a senzu bean and rise as though nothing had happened. This is established early and maintained throughout. The senzu beans are grown by Korin, the white, wand-carrying cat who inhabits a tower beneath the lookout, a figure from the original Dragon Ball series who continued to serve as the supply source for these seeds throughout the Z era. The growing process is slow, and the supply is consistently limited. Korin does not have an infinite supply, and the show occasionally acknowledges this by having characters use them sparingly or having the supply run low at critical moments, creating a real constraint rather than an unlimited resource. The existence of senzu beans creates a specific narrative dynamic. Characters who have access to them and who choose not to use them immediately in a battle are making a deliberate strategic choice. Goku giving Cell a senzu bean before the Cell games began, healing Cell to full health and allowing the battle to start from an even footing, was one of his more considered decisions in the series, and it reflects his specific philosophy about combat. He wanted the fight to be fair. He wanted Gohan to face Cell without any advantage other than his own power. Whether or not this was a wise decision is a question the show leaves open in interesting ways. The limits of senzu beans are also worth noting. They heal physical injury and restore ki. They do not address the psychological or emotional dimension of a battle. A character can be physically restored by a senzu bean and still be operating at a fraction of their effective capacity because of fear, grief, or psychological shock. Gohan's battle during the Cell games illustrates this in the negative direction. He was not physically impaired, but his reluctance to use his full power functioned as a kind of internal constraint that no healing item in the world could address. One of the most useful and narratively significant techniques in Dragon Ball Z is one that did not come from training with a god, a master, or a fellow Saiyan: instant transmission. The ability to teleport instantly to any location by locking onto a key signature at the target destination was learned by Goku from the inhabitants of a planet called Yardrat, where his ship was forced to land after the destruction of Namek. The planet Yardrat is mentioned briefly in dialogue and seen for only a moment in the series proper, but its inhabitants occupy an unusual place in the Dragon Ball Z universe. They are not powerful fighters in the conventional sense. They do not have extraordinary combat abilities or transformation-based power increases. What they have instead is a deep and sophisticated understanding of key manipulation, a technical mastery that produces techniques of remarkable practical utility. Instant transmission is perhaps the most famous of these, but the implication in supplementary materials is that Yardrat's key techniques extend considerably further. Goku spent approximately 1 year recovering on Yardrat after the Namek saga before returning to Earth. During that year, he learned instant transmission, which he used to near immediately affect the outcome of several subsequent conflicts. The technique requires the user to detect and focus on a key signature at the desired location, hold 2 fingers to the forehead as a concentration point, and then execute the teleportation. It carries no stated range limit beyond the ability to sense the target's key. The introduction of instant transmission permanently changed the tactical landscape of Dragon Ball Z, allowing characters to respond to threats at distances that would otherwise require travel time. More specifically, it allowed Goku to be present at critical moments he otherwise could not have reached in time, including the rescue of his friends from multiple dangerous situations, and most dramatically, the removal of Cell from Earth at the moment of Cell's attempted self-destruction. A technique from a nearly unknown planet quietly determined the outcome of the series' central conflict. The heart virus that kills Goku in future Trunks' timeline, and that nearly kills him in the main timeline as well, is one of the most quietly significant plot elements in Dragon Ball Z, because it demonstrates that the greatest warrior on the planet can be undone not by a more powerful enemy, but by a microscopic biological agent that no amount of training, transformation, or ki can address. Future Trunks travels back in time specifically to deliver medicine for this disease to Goku, having acquired it from a future where the knowledge of the cure existed, but where it arrived too late to save Goku's life. In the main timeline, Goku takes the medicine in advance and survives. In Trunks' original future, the medicine did not arrive in time. Goku died of the illness before ever fighting the androids, and the entire trajectory of that branch of history was altered by a biological vulnerability that had nothing to do with power levels. This detail carries a subtle thematic weight. Dragon Ball Z is a series about the continuous escalation of power, about pushing beyond limits, about training and transformation as responses to every conceivable challenge. And then, one of its most celebrated heroes is killed in one timeline by something that cannot be punched or transformed away from. The heart virus exists as a quiet reminder that the human body, even in its most extraordinary configurations, has limits that exist entirely outside the framework of combat power. Goku's recovery in the main timeline is treated with relief but relatively little ceremony. He wakes up, he is given his medicine, and the story moves forward. What lingers is the knowledge that this outcome required a traveler from a broken future bringing a cure backward through time, specifically to prevent a death that had already happened somewhere else. The medicine that saved Goku came from a world that had already lost him, and the series acknowledges this only briefly before moving on. The Super Saiyan transformation is perhaps the single most iconic moment in Dragon Ball Z. The blinding flash, the golden hair, the change in Goku's eyes from black to a pale blue-green, and it is a moment that the series spent an enormous amount of time building toward before it arrived. When it finally came, on the surface of a crumbling Namek with Frieza standing over the body of Krillin, It felt like something that had always been inevitable and something that had never been guaranteed at the same time. The mythology of Super Saiyan, as established in the series, requires a specific combination of inner conditions. The transformation is not achievable through training alone. It cannot be forced by willpower or desire, however intense those might be. What it requires, at least for the initial breakthrough, is a moment of overwhelming emotional extremity, specifically grief or rage, pushed past the point where any ordinary emotional response remains possible. The legend of the Super Saiyan in Dragon Ball Z's mythology is tied to emotion because the transformation itself was discovered through emotion. Vegeta's understanding of this, in the Saiyan Saga and the early Namek Saga, drives him to deliberate near-death situations. He asks Krillin to nearly kill him before Dende heals him, calculating that the Zenkai boost combined with the proximity to death will push his power closer to the threshold. His logic is correct in terms of the power increase, but incorrect in its assumption that power alone can produce the transformation. The Super Saiyan breakthrough requires something that cannot be manufactured through self-imposed suffering alone. Goku's transformation is triggered by witnessing Krillin's death, not the first time he had lost someone important, but a loss that arrived in a context of extraordinary isolation, after a battle of exhausting length, against an enemy whose sadism made the killing feel specifically chosen. Something in Goku broke in that moment and then was rebuilt in a different form. The Super Saiyan that stood up from that breaking was not merely angrier, it was calmer in a way than the man who had been fighting before, because what had been grief and desperation had become something colder and more resolved. The character of Future Trunks introduced a second timeline to the Dragon Ball Z continuity, a parallel version of the world in which the androids had defeated and killed the Z-Fighters, leaving a devastated Earth with only Trunks and his mentor Gohan alive as fighters. This alternate history was explored in a standalone television special called The History of Trunks, which aired in Japan in February of 1993 and ran for approximately 50 minutes. The television special depicted events that had been described but not shown in the main series. The deaths of the Z-Fighters, Gohan's training of the young Trunks, and the eventual conditions under which Trunks traveled back in time. It was produced as a separate project from the main series but within the same animation and production framework, using the same character designs and the same voice cast. It gave audiences the experience of a Dragon Ball Z where things had gone differently, a quieter, darker version of the same world, with the same characters diminished by different circumstances. Trunks in this alternate timeline was described as approximately 17 years old when he traveled back in time, a young man who had grown up under conditions of genuine danger and scarcity, trained by a version of Gohan who had lost an arm in combat and continued teaching and fighting despite the limitation. The bond between that Gohan and that Trunks was not detailed exhaustively in the series or the special, but the outlines were clear. A world reduced to two fighters working together with whatever resources remained for years. The Cell Saga's premise, a genetically engineered being created to be the perfect warrior, required the series to establish a backstory for Dr. Gero, the scientist behind the Red Ribbon Army, whose history extended back into the original Dragon Ball's events. Gero had spent decades working on his android project after the defeat of the Red Ribbon Army, and the scale of the project was described in terms that implied extraordinary resources and commitment. The androids created by Gero numbered more than the ones who appear in the main story. His laboratory, revealed during the Android Saga, contained the records of his work, design files, activation codes, and his most secret project, Cell. The Cell design was Gero's theoretical masterpiece, a being that incorporated the genetic material of the most powerful fighters the android's surveillance system had managed to observe and catalog. The surveillance program had been running for years, sending data back to Gero's laboratory while Goku and the others trained and fought and grew, collecting a record of development that became the template for Cell's design. The timeline mechanics of Cell's backstory were among the more complex pieces of continuity management in the series. Cell, in the main timeline, originated in the alternate future, having been sent back in time by the version of Dr. Gero's computer that existed in future Trunks' era, a second instance of time travel operating in parallel to the one that Trunks had undertaken. This created a situation in which there were, during the Cell Saga, at least 3 distinct versions of Trunks existing across different points in the timeline. The infant Trunks of the main timeline's present, the teenage future Trunks who had traveled from one future, and the implication of yet another divergent timeline. The Dragon Ball franchise extended into film productions throughout the run of the series. During the Dragon Ball Z period specifically, 13 theatrical films were released between 1989 and 1995, roughly 2 per year, timed to release during school holiday periods when attendance would be highest. These films were typically shorter than a standard feature length, running between 40 and 70 minutes, and they were screened as part of program packages that included shorter supporting films. The theatrical films existed in a complicated relationship with the canon of the main series. They were not, strictly speaking, continuations of the television story. Their events were not referenced by the main narrative, and some of them described events that would have contradicted the established timeline if taken as literal occurrences within the same continuity. They were perhaps best understood as parallel stories, using the same characters and the same world, exploring scenarios that the weekly series did not have room to develop. The film productions had their own design teams and animation directors, which meant that the visual presentation of the films often differed from the television series in ways that were subtle but noticeable. The characters might be drawn with slightly different proportions. Backgrounds might have a different level of detail or a different color palette. Action sequences might be animated with more frames per second than was practical for weekly television production. The films were opportunities to show the characters in the world at a higher level of visual investment than the regular schedule permitted. Akira Toriyama contributed to the films to varying degrees. For some, he provided character designs for new villains or settings. For others, his involvement was primarily in approving the concepts that the film staff had developed. The degree of his engagement with any particular film affected how closely it aligned with his visual sensibility and internal consistency. The Buu saga, which occupies the final portion of Dragon Ball Z, introduced a villain whose nature was described in terms that drew on older mythology and folklore, as well as the established mechanics of the Dragon Ball universe. Majin Buu, in his original sealed form, had been imprisoned for millions of years before the events of the saga, contained within a large egg-shaped vessel that the wizard Babidi used as the centerpiece of his plan to resurrect his father, Bibidi's creation. The backstory of Buu, the extent of the destruction he had caused before being sealed, the nature of his relationship with the Supreme Kais who had been responsible for managing the balance of the universe, was provided gradually across the saga, never all at once. The Supreme Kais themselves were an element of the world-building that the Buu saga introduced to the Dragon Ball Z continuity, expanding the cosmological scope of the series in the same way that the Namek saga had expanded it geographically. The Kais occupied a role in the franchise's cosmology as divine administrators, beings responsible for overseeing the development and balance of life in their respective quadrants of the universe. With King Kai being one of the lower-ranked members of this hierarchy, the Supreme Kai was the highest Kai in the universe, and the revelation of his existence and his interest in the Buu situation added context to King Kai's place in the hierarchy. He was, it turned out, a relatively local administrator, responsible for only his section of the galaxy, operating under a structure that extended far above him. The daily lives of the Z-fighters between the major crises of Dragon Ball Z were touched on across the series in ways that gave the world a texture beyond combat. Yamcha, after his death and resurrection in the Saiyan Saga, pursued a career in professional baseball, a detail that was consistent with his background as someone who had lived by his physical abilities and was looking for a constructive direction for them. He was shown playing, training for games, and living the ordinary life of a professional athlete alongside the extraordinary circumstances that occasionally interrupted it. Tien Shin Han spent the intervals between major events in training and in maintaining the three-eyed martial arts school that he had devoted himself to. He was one of the characters who engaged most consistently with the craft of martial arts as an end in itself rather than as a response to external threat. Training not because a new enemy was coming, but because the practice was its own purpose. He lived in a remote area and trained with Chiaotzu, his longtime partner and companion, in a relative solitude that suited his disposition. Krillin's life was perhaps the most domestically detailed of the non-Saiyan characters. He became a police officer during the period between the Cell Saga and the Buu Saga, a career that placed the strongest fully human fighter in the world into the ordinary apparatus of civilian law enforcement. He married Android 18, a choice that would have been difficult to predict from the circumstances under which they first met. Together they raised a daughter named Marin, and the household they maintained was depicted as stable, warm, and organized around an ordinary domestic rhythm. The question of how time was experienced across Dragon Ball Z's narrative is an interesting one when examined carefully. The in-universe timeline of Dragon Ball Z, reconstructed from the evidence within the series and from official timeline documents, including one published in the Daisen Shu, covers a span from age 761, when the Saiyan Saga begins, to age 774, when the Buu Saga concludes. That is 13 years of in-universe time, a span in which Gohan grew from a 4-year-old child to a young adult with a wife and a daughter. Within those 13 years, the actual events that constitute the dramatic action of the series represent a small fraction of the total time elapsed. The Saiyan Saga covers roughly a year, with the year of preparation before the Saiyans' arrival accounting for much of the time. The Frieza Saga covers only days, its celebrated narrative compression, in which events that should have taken minutes stretch across many episodes, created a disconnect between screen time and in-universe time that the series never fully resolved and never needed to. The story was not interested in naturalistic time the way a novel might be. It moved at the speed the emotion required. The longest single documented period in the main Dragon Ball Z timeline without a major external threat was the 10 years between the conclusion of the Cell Saga at the end of age 767 and the beginning of the Buu Saga at age 774. During those 10 years, Goku was dead, having sacrificed himself to prevent Cell's self-destruction from destroying the Earth. Gohan was growing up, studying, starting high school. The world was recovering, and Goku was training in the other world, maintaining his capabilities in the afterlife with a thoroughness that suggested he never really rested, even in death. The design of the characters in Dragon Ball Z was developed by Toriyama and then adapted by the animation team at Toei into designs suitable for weekly television production. This process involved simplification, the elimination of details that would be time-consuming to reproduce across thousands of frames, while preserving the essential visual identity that Toriyama had established in the manga. Toriyama's art style was influenced by the American cartoons and comics he had grown up watching, and by the manga of Osamu Tezuka, the foundational figure of Japanese comics who had established many of the visual conventions that the medium still used. His character designs tended toward clean lines, readable silhouettes, and expressive faces that could communicate emotion clearly even at small sizes or in fast-moving sequences. The tendency toward humor, the slightly exaggerated expressions, the occasional cartoonish reaction, was integrated into the same visual language as the more serious dramatic moments. The costume designs for the Saiyan characters drew on visual elements from space opera science fiction and from traditional martial arts uniforms. The Saiyan armor, with its characteristic shoulder pads and chest plate configuration, was described in Daisen Shu materials as a standard military uniform rather than a personal design choice, something issued to soldiers of the Frieza Force and worn because it was practical and available. The specific colors of different characters' armor were individual variations within a standard form, like the way uniforms might vary in detail while conforming to the same general specification. Goku's distinctive orange gi, which he wore throughout the series, was the uniform of the Turtle School, the martial arts lineage established by Master Roshi of which both Goku and Krillin were students. The kanji on the back and chest of the gi changed across the series to reflect different mentors, wearing the character for King Kai after his training in the other world, Kami after his training at the Lookout. A quiet way of indicating whose influence he was currently drawing on that required no dialogue to convey. The voice recording process for Japanese animation of the Dragon Ball Z era typically worked in a sequence that is the reverse of the approach used in most Western animation production. In Japan, the animation was generally completed first, or at least largely storyboarded and timed, before the voice actors came in to record. The actors performed their lines to match the already drawn or already planned character movements, fitting their delivery to the timing and expression of the animation, rather than the other way around. This approach placed particular demands on the actor's ability to adapt, to find within the time constraints of a given mouth movement or facial expression the full range of what the scene required emotionally. The best Dragon Ball Z performances, in both the Japanese and English versions, were ones in which the technical requirements of matching the animation felt invisible, where the voice seemed to be generating the character's emotion rather than being fitted to an external form. Recording sessions for weekly animation were typically conducted under significant time pressure. The schedule of a weekly series meant that episodes were completed on tight timelines, and voice recording was one of the later steps in the production pipeline. It had to wait for the animation to be sufficiently complete to record to, which meant that recording sessions were often held very close to the delivery date. The actors worked quickly, with minimal time between takes, trusting their preparation and instinct rather than multiple attempts at refinement. Masako Nozawa has described in interviews the way she approached Goku's characteristic Saiyan scream, the extended, escalating vocalization that accompanied major power-ups and transformations. She described it as a physical as well as vocal effort, requiring a kind of full-body engagement that was vocally demanding in a technical sense. The fact that she performed these scenes without the extended preparation that a more leisurely recording schedule might have allowed is a testament to the professional infrastructure she had developed across decades of voice work. The Dragon Ball Super television series, which ran from July of 2015 to March of 2018, expanded the cosmological scope of the Dragon Ball universes significantly, introducing the concept of multiple universes, 12 universes in total, each with its own planets, civilizations, and gods of destruction. This expansion retroactively established the setting of Dragon Ball Z as taking place in Universe 7, one of 12 parallel universes that shared the same space-time framework under the oversight of a being called the Xeno, or Omni King. The Tournament of Power, which formed the climactic arc of Dragon Ball Super, was a martial arts tournament involving fighters from 8 of the 12 universes, with the stakes being the erasure from existence of the universes that lost. The logistics of organizing a tournament between representatives of 8 universes simultaneously was handled through the Xeno's Arena of Void, a space between universes where all 80 contestants fought simultaneously on a single stage until only one universe's team remained standing. This expansion of scale was consistent with the trajectory of Dragon Ball Z across its own run, a story that had begun on Earth and expanded to Namek, to the galaxy, and to the cosmos. Each new arc tended to introduce a new highest level of power and a new widest scope of consequences. The Tournament of Power simply extended this expansion to its logical, cosmological conclusion. All of existence, measured in universes rather than planets, with a character powerful enough to eliminate a universe the way one might switch off a light. The Broly film, released in December of 2018 and titled Dragon Ball Super Broly, served to canonize the character of Broly, who had appeared in earlier non-canon films, within the official continuity of the franchise. It also provided the most detailed visual account of the Saiyan homeworld and the circumstances of its destruction that had yet been produced, depicting the final hours of Planet Vegeta with a care and specificity that the earlier versions of those events had only sketched. Toriyama completed his manga work on Dragon Ball in 1995 and did not produce a new Dragon Ball manga series until Dragon Ball Super in 2015. A gap of 20 years during which the franchise continued through animation, video games, merchandise, and fan engagement, sustained by its cultural presence despite the absence of new core creative work from its originator. His return to the franchise in 2015 re-established the creative direction of the story and was accompanied by his continued involvement in character design and story supervision. His interviews from the Dragon Ball Super period revealed a working style that had not fundamentally changed. He continued to work in his rural studio, continued to use toy models for visual reference, continued to approach the story with the same combination of plan and improvisation that had characterized his original run. He had mentioned in various contexts that Goku was never intended to be a straightforwardly admirable hero in the Western tradition, that he was designed as someone who simply loved fighting and training, who was good-hearted but not particularly thoughtful or emotionally sophisticated in the conventional sense, and that the character's appeal was rooted in that specific combination of qualities. Toriyama passed away on the 1st of March, 2024, at the age of 68, from an acute subdural hematoma. His death was announced by Bird Studio and Shueisha shortly afterwards, and the response across the global community of Dragon Ball fans reflected the scale of the connection that people had formed with the work he had produced across 4 decades. The franchise he created has sold approximately 260 million manga volumes worldwide and spawned animated series, films, video games, merchandise, and cultural references that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single medium or any single country. The video game history of Dragon Ball Z is its own considerable documentation. The first video game based on the Dragon Ball franchise was released in 1986 for the Famicom, and the series has been continuously present in gaming since then across nearly every platform and format. Dragon Ball Z games specifically have included fighting games, role-playing games, strategy games, and adventure games produced by numerous different developers over 4 decades. The Budokai series, which began in 2002, was among the most commercially successful and critically recognized of the Dragon Ball Z fighting game franchises, and its two-dimensional fighting game approach, transitioning to 3 dimensions in Budokai 3, was influential on the subsequent development of the fighting game genre within licensed anime properties. The Tenkaichi series, which followed and overlapped, emphasized a different kind of 3-dimensional combat and eventually featured a roster of playable characters numbering in the hundreds. The Xenoverse series, beginning in 2015, introduced the conceit of the player as a time patroller, a created character operating within the Dragon Ball timeline to correct temporal distortions caused by villains altering historical events. This narrative framework allowed the games to revisit established Dragon Ball Z events, while also creating space for new scenarios, and its approach to the franchise's accumulated history was essentially archaeological, treating the established canon as a landscape to be explored and engaged with, rather than simply retold. The quiet persistence of Dragon Ball Z across more than 3 decades since its original broadcast is something that rewards a moment of calm consideration. The series ended its first run in 1996, and it has not been absent from public consciousness since. It has moved across platforms, formats, and generations, from VHS tapes in rental stores to broadcast television to streaming services and official YouTube channels. Each migration has brought it to new audiences while maintaining its connection to those who encountered it originally. The specific pleasure that Dragon Ball Z has provided to so many viewers across so many decades is not simply the product of the action sequences or the transformations, though those are clearly central to its identity. It is also the product of the world it built with such patient consistency, the rules it established and kept, the characters it developed and maintained, the small details it accumulated across hundreds of episodes, until the world felt like it had a reality that extended beyond what was shown on screen. The hyperbolic time chamber continues to stand within the lookout, its door marked with the characters that mean room of spirit and time. Korin grows his beans in his garden above the clouds. The Dragon Balls scatter at the end of each wish and wait stone-gray and patient for a year to pass. The Saiyan armor sits in the Capsule Corporation storage facility, labeled in a catalog that Dr. Brief has probably not reorganized in many years. These things exist in the world of the story with the same quiet permanence as the things that are shown and dramatized. And perhaps this is what the smallest, quietest facts of Dragon Ball Z ultimately speak to: the commitment of the people who made it to building a world real enough that its details could accumulate without contradiction, its corners populated without being explicitly shown, its history extending beyond what any single episode needed to address, a world that felt like it kept going even when the camera was not watching. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new. The Capsule Corporation building is one of the most recognizable pieces of architecture in the world of Dragon Ball Z, and its design reflects something about the franchise's visual philosophy: the coexistence of the extraordinary and the mundane within the same frame. The domed structure sits in the middle of West City, a city whose urban character suggests something between Tokyo and a generalized futuristic metropolis, with streets and traffic and the ordinary texture of city life. And there, in the middle of all of that ordinary life, is a dome with a corporation logo on the side, where inside, among other things, a spacecraft capable of interstellar travel has been parked in a garage, and a room full of gravity strong enough to kill an ordinary person is available for use before breakfast. This quality, the normalization of the extraordinary, was one of the consistent pleasures of the world that Toriyama built. Nobody in West City seemed particularly alarmed by the Capsule Corporation building. Nobody in the Dragon Ball Z world found it strange that a private company manufactured devices that could fold a house into a pill-sized container. These things had simply always been available. The technology had been there long enough to become ordinary, and the ordinary had adjusted around it the way water adjusts around a stone. Dr. Brief himself was a figure of considerable intellectual achievement, whose personality was, by most depictions, warm, somewhat absent-minded, and focused primarily on the next project rather than on any of the ones already completed. He kept a remarkable number of pets, a menagerie of animals that seemed to expand with each appearance of the Brief family home, and his workspace reflected the accumulation of a lifetime of working scientists who never quite finished putting things away. The lab where he built and maintained Saiyan gravity chambers and spacecraft was described and shown as a place where order was less important than access, the ability to find the thing you needed when you needed it, even if the system for finding it was only legible to the person who had built it. The city of West City was the largest urban center in the portion of the Dragon Ball Z world that the story primarily occupied. It was not the only major city. East City, South City, and North City were all referenced at various points, oriented around the cardinal directions as naming conventions. But it was the one most frequently visited and most thoroughly depicted. Its geography was consistent enough across the series to suggest that the animators had a specific reference map or background set that they worked from, even if that map was never displayed explicitly. The world that Dragon Ball Z occupied was, by the geography described and shown, Earth, recognizably the same Earth as the one in the original Dragon Ball, which was recognizably a fictionalized and extended version of the real world. The land masses were similar to, but not identical with, real-world geography. The presence of flying cars and hoi-poi capsule technology suggested a technological divergence from real Earth, but the cultural and social texture of daily life was broadly familiar. Markets, schools, police, television, city blocks, countryside, rivers. The Kame house, the small pink island-dwelling house where Master Roshi lived, was positioned somewhere in the Pacific Ocean by the geography of the world, accessible by boat or by air. It was one of the more memorable visual locations in the series, immediately recognizable by its pink color and its isolation. A small building on a small island with nothing visible in any direction but open water. Roshi lived there with his turtle and, for extended periods, with Krillin or other students, in a domestic arrangement that was modest even by the standards of the series. The fighting style taxonomy of Dragon Ball Z, the named schools, the lineages of technique, the specific teachers and their students, is a quiet thread that runs through the whole series, connecting characters to one another through the art they share. The Turtle School, founded by Master Roshi, produced Goku and Krillin as its most notable graduates, and through Goku, Gohan, and eventually Goten. The Crane School, the rival lineage trained by Master Shen, produced Tien and Chiaotzu. These two schools were rivals whose techniques paralleled and opposed each other, just as their founders' personalities did. The training philosophy associated with the Turtle School emphasized foundation, the development of basic strength, speed, and ki control through repetitive physical conditioning before advancing to more complex technique. Roshi's training methods in the original Dragon Ball, while they appeared eccentric, carrying heavy objects, chasing small animals through difficult terrain, manual labor, were described as indirect approaches to building the physical basis from which all technique eventually grew. By the time of Dragon Ball Z, Roshi's own power had been surpassed many times over by his students, a fact he acknowledged with equanimity rather than resentment. The Piccolo style of training, which Gohan experienced directly, prioritized early exposure to real danger and rapid adaptation. Piccolo placed his students in situations that required performance under conditions of genuine threat, on the logic that the fastest learning occurred when the consequences of failure were real. The results, in Gohan's case, were remarkable. A child who had developed more rapidly than almost anyone else in the series, and who possessed raw potential that consistently surprised even those who knew him well. Vegeta's independent training habits were described and depicted with a consistency that said something about his character, without requiring extensive commentary. He trained constantly, with a focus and discipline that was closer to obsession than to hobby. His training regimes in the gravity room were structured around the pursuit of a specific target, always Goku, always the aspiration of surpassing what Goku was, or had been, or was becoming. And this orientation, while it provided direction, also created a ceiling shaped by someone else's achievement. Android 16 is one of the most quietly affecting characters in the Cell arc of Dragon Ball Z, in part because his nature is so thoroughly at odds with his origin and his context. He is a mechanical being, built for combat, designed by Dr. Gero as a weapon. He is also among the gentlest and most consistently peaceful presences in the arc, expressing a love for living things, specifically birds, in several memorable scenes that sits in profound contrast to the destructive purpose for which he was made. This is not accidental. 16's design, as revealed in supplementary materials, was based on Gero's son, a young man of similar physical proportions who had been a soldier and had been killed in action. Gero recreated the appearance of his son in android form, but the project became something else in the process, producing a being who shared the physical template of a soldier, but whose internal nature had something different at its core. Whether this was intentional or a consequence of the gap between what Gero wanted to create and what the creation became, the show does not fully explain. 16's primary programmed objective was the termination of Goku, a directive installed by Gero, who had never removed his hatred of Goku from any of his creations. But 16's interpretation of this directive was specific and notably restrained. He was willing to pursue Goku. He was not willing to harm bystanders or participate in violence against innocents. The distinction, while subtle in terms of its practical expression, communicates something important about the kind of being 16 was, one whose programming existed alongside a set of values that the programming could not fully overwrite. His final moment in the Cell games, his speech to Gohan before Cell destroys him, telling Gohan that it is acceptable to fight, acceptable to express anger in defense of the world one loves, that protecting life is not a contradiction of a gentle nature but its fullest expression, became the catalyst for Gohan's Super Saiyan 2 transformation. The most important emotional trigger of the Cell arc came from a character who had been present for most of it, and who ended it with words rather than power. The gentle giant who loved birds and refused to hurt innocents became, in his last moment, the key that unlocked the arc's climax. The Cell Games represent something unusual in the Dragon Ball Z narrative, a large-scale, globally significant event that the show makes a point of framing as a spectacle watched by the ordinary world. Where most of the series' major battles happened in remote locations or in outer space, the Cell Games took place at an arena that Cell himself constructed, and then broadcast an invitation to the world from, challenging anyone to come and fight him within 10 days or watch him destroy humanity. This framing introduces the world's general population into the story in a way that Dragon Ball Z rarely does. The news media covered Cell's announcement. Ordinary people watched. Governments responded, and amid this global attention, Hercule, the world martial arts champion, the most famous human fighter in the world, arrived at the Cell Games to represent humanity in the most public possible way. His fight with Cell lasted approximately 3 seconds. He was swatted aside before any meaningful exchange occurred, and then the real fighters arrived, and the nature of what the world was actually dealing with became visible. A gap so vast between the power of the Z fighters and the power of any conventional human that the broadcast audience could not even process what they were seeing. The cameras could barely track the movement. The sheer scale of the key techniques defied any frame of reference available to ordinary observers. The world ultimately attributed the victory in the Cell Games to Hercule because the Z fighters disappeared in the aftermath, and because Hercule was the only person left standing at the arena who was both alive and recognizable. The show treats this attribution with gentle comedy, Hercule accepting the credit, the world believing him, the truth being something that the people who actually knew it were not particularly interested in correcting. It is one of Dragon Ball Z's quieter and more peculiar ongoing jokes, the idea that the most important battles in Earth's history were consistently invisible to the people whose lives they preserved. The final battle of Dragon Ball Z, the confrontation between Goku and Kid Buu on the sacred world of the Kais, takes place on a location that carries more history than the show takes time to explain in detail. The sacred world of the Kaises, the realm of the Supreme Kais, the divine overseers of the universe, existing at a remove from ordinary space that makes it accessible only through specific means. It is ancient, quiet, and entirely unprepared for the kind of destruction that the battle between Goku and Kid Buu produces. The decision to bring the final confrontation to this location, rather than a more conventional battle arena or Earth itself, is a narrative choice that places the climax of the series in the most cosmically significant space available. This is not an anonymous planet. This is the home of the universe's divine administration, or what remains of it after Buu's ancient campaign. The fight that happens here is not just a fight between a Saiyan and a monster. It is a fight happening at the center of the universe's governing mythology, and the implications of either outcome extend farther than any previous Dragon Ball Z conflict. Kid Buu's destruction of the sacred world of the Kais during the fight, the planet literally being torn apart and reshaped by the energies involved, is presented with a kind of resigned acceptance by the surviving Kais watching the battle. They have, at this point, endured more than mortal imagination can comfortably hold. The planet's destruction is one more piece of damage in a series of catastrophic events that began millions of years ago and that is at last approaching something that might be called an end. And then Goku's spirit bomb completes, and the ending comes, and the sacred world is quiet, and what was once the oldest battlefield in the universe is suddenly simply a quiet place again. Battered and changed, but quiet. Still, the way things are after something enormous has finally finished. The Dragon Ball Z afterlife is more structured and bureaucratic than most fictional cosmologies attempt. And King Yema, the enormous, red-faced figure who sits behind a massive desk at the entrance to the next world, is its most human-facing administrator. He processes souls with the efficiency of someone who has been doing an essentially impossible job for a very long time and has made peace with its demands. Every soul that dies from every corner of the universe under his jurisdiction eventually passes through his office. The afterlife in Dragon Ball Z is organized into distinct regions. Hell, referred to in the original Japanese simply as the place where the wicked go, exists as a specific location, not merely a metaphorical state. Heaven, similarly, has geographic reality within the cosmology. Snake Way exists as a literal road between Yema's office and King Kai's planet. Otherworld is a place with weather, gravity, training grounds, and martial arts tournaments of its own. It is a complete realm, not simply an absence of the living world, and characters who have died in the series spend their afterlife time doing things that resemble what they did while living. The check-in system that Yema manages, the process of evaluating souls and directing them to their appropriate destinations, is taken seriously by the show in its early presentation and then treated more casually as the series progresses and afterlife sequences become more frequent. By the Buu arc, characters are moving between the living world and the afterlife with enough regularity that the boundary between them has a lived-in familiarity that the Saiyan Saga could not have anticipated. Yema's consistent presence across these transitions, always at his desk, always with his stack of papers, always processing the apparently infinite paperwork of universal mortality, is one of the show's small continuity anchors, a reminder that even in a universe of transformations and escalating power, some things simply continue doing what they were always doing. The Great Elder Guru is one of the most quietly significant figures in the Namek arc of Dragon Ball Z, and his importance operates on multiple levels simultaneously. He is the oldest living Namekian, the father of all other Namekians on the planet, at the time of the Frieza arc, and the creator and guardian of the Namekian Dragon Balls. He is also, at the time the heroes encounter him, already dying, his decline accelerated by grief over the violence being done to his people and his world. Guru's power as a guardian and an elder extends beyond simply holding the Dragon Balls. He possessed the ability to unlock latent potential in individuals who came to him, a skill he demonstrated with Krillin, Gohan, and Dende during the Namek Saga, each of whom received a significant power increase through his unlocking of their inner reserves. This ability connects to a Namekian tradition of recognizing and releasing what is already present, rather than building something new, a philosophy consistent with the species' broader biological and cultural tendencies. His relationship with his attendant Nail, a Namekian warrior whose sole purpose was to serve and protect Guru, is one of the quieter background elements of the Namek arc. Nail was among the most powerful Namekians on the planet, capable of fighting at a level that exceeded most of Frieza's elite soldiers, and yet his entire existence was organized around the service of one elderly being who could not move from his seat. When Nail eventually merges with Piccolo to give the hero a chance against Frieza's forces, the merge is presented as a willing act, a warrior choosing a final purpose that transcends his original role. Guru's death during the Namekian Dragon Balls to become inert and the summoned wishes to fail is handled with a restraint that respects the weight of the moment. He was the last keeper of everything the Namekians had built on their dying world. His passing, in the midst of the greatest threat that world had ever faced, represents a kind of ending that no Dragon Ball can simply reverse. The Z-Sword, which appears early in the Buu arc of Dragon Ball Z, is introduced as the legendary sword of the Supreme Kais, a weapon so heavy that no ordinary being could hope to lift it. Embedded in a rock on the sacred world of the Kais, in the same way that legendary weapons in myth are always embedded somewhere impossible, and waiting for the right person to come along. Gohan, whose extraordinary latent power made him the natural candidate for the attempt, eventually manages to pull the sword free. What the Z-Sword was actually supposed to do, whether its use in combat would have produced meaningful results against the threats of the Buu arc, became moot almost immediately. During training with the weapon, Goku threw a large block of stone at the sword, and the stone shattered the blade. The ancient legendary weapon of the Supreme Kais broke, and from inside the broken sword, sealed within its crystalline structure for millennia, emerged the Elder Kai, an ancient Supreme Kai who had been trapped inside the sword by a rival long before the events of the series began. The Elder Kai's emergence is one of the more unusual character introductions in Dragon Ball Z, a god sealed inside a sword by another god, emerging because a human broke the sword with a rock, now available to provide abilities and guidance that no currently active character could have offered. His eccentric personality, his willingness to spend 10 hours performing a ritual to unlock Gohan's latent power, his complaints about the length of time the procedure required, all contribute to an introduction that is tonally distinctive even by Dragon Ball Z's standards. The power unlocked in Gohan by the Elder Kai's ritual, the form sometimes called Ultimate Gohan or Mystic Gohan, represents the full realization of the potential that the series had been building in the character since the very beginning. It does not involve a conventional transformation. His hair does not change color. The power is simply present, fully accessible without the emotional or physical stress that other power states required to maintain. It is the quiet resolution of a thread that began with Goku and Piccolo, both recognizing something unusual in a 5-year-old child, carried forward across the entire series. And so the world of Dragon Ball Z rests in its details as much as in its battles. In the names that no one explains, in the biological truths that hide in plain sight, in the quiet decisions made by characters between the loud moments that everyone remembers. The story is deeper than it always appears, slower in its careful construction than its pacing suggests, more internally consistent than the enormity of its canvas makes easy to appreciate. Every technique has a history. Every character has a thread connecting them to something that came before. Every moment of power conceals a moment of cost that the series never forgot, even when the spectacle was at its most brilliant. The naming system built by Toriyama runs from the first Saiyan to the last. The grief beneath Gero's workshop is the same grief that shaped Android 16. The friendship between a human champion and a pink monster of ancient evil changed the outcome of the universe's final battle. These are the stories that live beneath the surface, the ones that make the larger story hold together, that give the battles their weight, that turn what might otherwise be spectacle into something that has stayed with so many people for so long. They are not hidden exactly. They are simply waiting the way most worthwhile things wait, patiently, quietly for someone willing to look. In time, even the most familiar stories reveal their quieter layers. Dragon Ball Z has been revealing its for more than 3 decades now, and there is still more to find. Perhaps, still. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.